About a month ago, my wife and our son and I were out for a walk. We were walking across the beautiful campus of the University of Virginia down in Charlottesville, and we saw a statue. It was across the road from the original basketball gymnasium there on Emmett Street, just before you reach a beautiful pond on the right if you're heading south. My wife and son asked if it was a demon, because from a distance that's what it looked like. It was a life-size statue. But I could tell it was something, though ominous looking and foreboding, it was something different. I thought maybe it was a forest fairy. We got closer, got right up to it, and we saw that it was humanoid in nature. It was on its knees, and it had its hands out like this, and everything about it, other than its human features, was a flame, like a fire. And its torso was open, and there was flames, and this is all metal. It was one of the most beautiful metal statues I've ever seen. And I hate to even say the name of it, because like I said, it's about a month ago. I think it was called The Messenger, and I wish I could remember the artist's name, but I remember there was a quote on a plaque on the bottom of the statue, and I know I'm going to get this right. This isn't going to be exact, but it said to the effect, "Those who shine a bright light, a flame like a torch throughout the world so that others may see, must be willing to burn to their core." And it was a quote by a guy named Viktor Frankel. And I read that and I said, wow, that's ironic. And my wife said, why? Who is Viktor Frankel? And I said, well, he's many things. He was many things. But just yesterday, I actually started reading one of his books. True story. You talk about serendipity, and that's something that I've talked quite a bit about on this channel. Here's the actual book. It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankel. I'll note Dr. Frankel. He had PhDs in two different areas, psychoanalysis and something else. It's in the book. Lots in the... I tell you, I get chills thinking about what's in this book, but I'm going to share some of it with you. And there is a correlation between this video and one that I recently made that I think brought a lot of you to this channel. It was that video titled, "You're Probably Going to Unsubscribe," or "I'm Probably Going to Lose Subscribers by Saying These Things, but I'm going to say them anyway." And I basically, that was a book review about on a book called Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. Talked about the culture of Appalachia and how that, if you're from that culture, how that can affect you going forward in life, and how there are a bunch of erroneous stereotypes tied to that. And that was something very meaningful to me because I'm from that culture. Many of you who've watched the video are as well. You've shared that. I so appreciate your comments. I've gotten so much out of your comments. Thank you for those comments. What I'm going to talk to you about in this video, and it's in regard to Dr. Frankel's work here, might offend you so much that you never come back to watch another video on this channel again. All I'm going to ask of you, if you find yourself feeling like that throughout the course of this talk, is hear me out, give me a chance. It does come full circle. So this book really consists of two books. It was his original work, Man's Search for Meaning, which basically was his story of 3 years worth of his life lived in 4 different concentration camps during the Second World War. Dr. Frankel was an Austrian Jew. He was rounded up with his family, his parents, his wife, sent to the camps by the Germans during the Second World War. And I will tell you, if you read this book, it's very graphic. Be prepared for some very unpleasant images in your mind as you read his words. But really, I don't think we could even begin to understand what a lot of these folks, like Dr. Frankel, went through if they weren't graphic with their stories. The second half of the book, he basically discusses a form of psychoanalysis that he developed largely as a result of his experiences in the camps, but namely due to his survival of those camps. It's called logotherapy. It's something he practiced professionally going forward here in the U.S., in Colorado, and also throughout Europe as a practicing psychiatrist and as a professor in colleges. before he passed away, I believe in 1997. But while reading the first half of the book, where he talks about his experiences in the camps, the question that continually came to my mind was, oh my God, how in the world did this guy and so many others survive that? How did they live through that? I can't get as graphic as he did in the book here on this channel because it's not appropriate. But he talked about basically the dehumanization that the Jewish people went through immediately upon being sent into those camps. They were stripped of all physical possessions, their clothes, they were shaved, their hair, all their body hair. They were given numbers. They were tattooed. Their numbers were tattooed onto their arms. This is how they were known. They did not have names. They weren't given pronouns. They were known as numbers. And this was to completely and entirely dehumanize them and take away any form of dignity that they possessed. It worked. These things, as well as the abuse, the treatment, the punishment, working in sub-freezing temperatures, wearing t-shirts and pajama pants that had holes in them that belonged to prisoners who had already perished. And these clothes are taken from these perished prisoners and given to the new prisoners as they come in on day one. Up at 5 a.m., out to dig holes to run gas pipelines or whatever until well after dark, and they were fed a piece of bread about this big and one ladleful of broth every day, and that's it. And he survived this for 3 years in 4 different camps. And that's graphic enough, but he gets even more graphic with some more specific stories. Some prisoners he saw perished. And again, as I read these horrors, as I read these nightmares, not only did I ask myself, how can human beings do this to each other? But again, I asked myself, how did he make it through that? And he said throughout the book, he said, when there is a will, you can live through any how. And I thought, what was his will? What was it that willed him through living like that to where he was able to make it where so many others couldn't? And he talked about how when people would just lose their will to live and they would kind of accept their fate, and he talked about this like 48-hour process in which they basically just gave up, wouldn't get out of bed to go to work that day, smuggled out their one hidden cigarette they had somehow, smoked it, and then just laid there and slowly died over the next 48 hours. I asked, what was the difference between him and those who made it and those? And again, he kept coming back in the book and he said, over and over, where there is a will, when you have a will, you will figure out how to live through anything. He said this is something that is unique to human beings. So what was his will? What was the will that propelled him forward? It was 2 things originally, but then it became a third. And I want to share those with you now. And there is a correlation between what we talked about with Hillbilly Elegy and why us, hillbillies are the way we are. And J.D. Vance talked about how, and he said this in his words in his book, that the only way up for a hillbilly is out. Well, how do you do that? How do you get out so that you can move up? Well, Dr. Frankel kind of answers that question for us with his third reason, his third will to live for all of us, something he didn't realize until he was out of those camps many years later. Okay, because the other 2 were not there for him anymore. One of them, his biggest will that kept him going, was the love for his wife. His young wife, she was 23 when they were rounded up. They were sent to separate camps because when they got to the camps, men went to the right and women went to the left. He talks about how in the camp, celebrating her birthday with memories and fantasies in his mind, and it was only later, after he was released, he found out that when he was doing that, celebrating her birthday in his mind in that camp, she was already dead. She had died days before that in her camp. But it was his love for his wife, his will to see her again, that kept him going, along with Number 2, purpose. Okay, he had a will to figure out the how to live through that, how to survive through that, because of the love he had for another human being, in this case his wife, and because he felt that he had a purpose. What was his purpose? A very unsuccessful book he had written but hadn't published. It was his first book. He had written it. It was ready to go to publishing, but he hadn't done that yet. He was rounded up and sent off to the camps. He had the manuscript with him when he went into the camp. He actually had it in the lining of his jacket, in print format, paper form. Of course, it was taken from him. Well, he felt, even though critics later would not think, that this work was something that was worth reading. The masses need to know what he said in this book. So while he was in those camps, while he was out there working 15, 18 hours a day in sub-freezing temperatures with no shoes, because the shoes would just, you'd fall off your feet from wear, and you didn't get replacements. And he was in t-shirts that had holes, pajama pants that had holes, fingers freezing, and he was rewriting in his head that book that was taken from him. They took everything from him physically. They tried to take every aspect of his dignity by taking his name, his body hair, and calling him a number. But he didn't let them. He refused to give them that. He kept his dignity. Okay? He didn't flaunt it. He wasn't stupid. He didn't go... The inner fight this guy had. We've all heard the expression, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Dr. Frankel had one hell of a size of a fight inside him. So he had the love for his wife, and he had his purpose. Okay? Well, he would get out of those camps when he and so many other Jews who were tortured and imprisoned like this during the Holocaust were freed by Allied forces. He talks about the day the American soldiers showed up at his camp specifically, and what a wondrous day that was. They were liberated, and then of course he would soon find out that his wife was dead. He would go on and publish that book with very marginal success, if any. And that's when he discovered the third will that gives a sense of purpose to us in life. Some of you, of course, who are watching this might lack, and don't be surprised, especially if you're in the U.S. and we have viewers all over the world, a lot of folks in England, all over Europe, of course, friends and family back in Asia, and all over the United States. But 60%, and these are numbers that come from this book, 60% of Americans feel like they have no purpose, and the reason is because they don't. A considerable percentage of people around the world feel this way, but the numbers are exceptionally high here in the U.S. And I'm going to tell you why, and if you fall into this category, and once upon a time I did myself, I'm going to tell you how you can kind of get out of that, and that's where the second half of this book comes in, the logotherapy. And it basically confirmed to me that though everybody calls me crazy, everybody says I'm a nut, everybody says I should get a real job, and blah, 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 confirmation, I've actually been doing it right for quite a while. And the majority of the problems I've had in my past come from when I was doing it wrong. This is going to make a lot of sense to you here really soon. Logotherapy, in a nutshell, is this. Whereas most psychoanalysis, most psychiatrists, most therapists focus on events from our past. What happened during childhood? Where are we from? Hillbilly elegy. What was the culture we were brought up in? These being the things that turned us into who we are, largely, and cause us to be where we are today, have the feelings we have, maybe have some of the hang-ups that we have, okay? Logotherapy and Dr. Frankel's take on psychoanalysis is the first form of therapy that is forward-looking, okay, forward-thinking. He says, okay, those things happened. This is where we are today. Where do we want to be going forward? And there's a very special way that he points out we can do this. I'm going to share this with you at the end. It's like magic. I'm going to give you the formula, okay? he uses the example of it was an American statesman. He was an ambassador, I believe, who was miserable at his job. He worked for the State Department. That's what it was. Hated his job, was miserable. He had a therapist he was working with. He'd worked with him for 5 years. And the therapist had this guy thinking that the reason he was miserable, the reason he hated his job, and the reason he wasn't happy was because, in a very Freudian sense, he viewed his employer, the U.S. government, as a father figure. And this guy had a very tragic relationship with his father. Basically, it was a toxic, unhealthy relationship with his father. So the therapist was trying to get this guy to think that until he fixed the relationship with his father, or came to terms with that, he would always be miserable, he would always hate his job, yada, yada, yada. So he goes to see Dr. Frankel. Dr. Frankel simply asks him, do you enjoy the work that you do? And the guy says, no, I don't. And he says, then why are you doing it? Is it of a necessity that you keep this job you have and you don't pursue any endeavors in any other line of profession? And the guy said, well, no, I guess it's not. And so they spent some time talking, figured out what the guy enjoyed doing. The guy quit his job, took on a job he liked in a completely different field, and had a life filled with joy. He experienced happiness going forward because he wasn't doing something that made him miserable. And herein lies the biggest part of the answer. Okay, and I made some notes here. Being happy versus being joyous, being filled with joy. Listen, happiness is contingent upon the result of an outcome, okay? If our team wins a Super Bowl, whoever Tom Brady's playing for, if we win the Super Bowl, we're going to be happy. If our team loses the Super Bowl, we're not going to be happy. In that situation, our happiness is contingent upon the result, an outcome. Joy is a state of being. We're either joyful or we're not. We can love the game of football, and regardless who wins, we still find ourselves filled with joy by watching the game, participating in the event. Okay, 60% of Americans hate, or that's a strong term. I'll use the term, are unhappy with the work they do. To the point of, at times, being clinically depressed and going through years of therapy trying to figure out how to like or be happy with doing something they don't enjoy doing. Guys, that's insanity. It's not possible. The softer, simpler way would be Dr. Frankel's way. Why not find out what it is you like and do that? And experience joy. Have a life filled with joy. Okay? Now, the third purpose he found, and it relates to this, because in his case it was necessary, but in yours it's not. Okay? Purpose, in his case, spreading a message with his books. Love of another human being, in his case, his wife. Thirdly, what he came to grips with after he found out, the book was a flop, his wife was gone. Having gone through suffering in such a way that you're able to make choices in your life to where it was worth it in that you can benefit others as a result of your suffering. And that's what Dr. Frankel did. He spent the rest of his life turning those 4 miserable years in those concentration camps into a way to positively influence other people. He did it with logotherapy, and he did it with this message. If you're not happy, if you're suffering and it's unnecessary, stop. Okay? And the example we gave here, your job you hate that makes you miserable. I can relate to that. I used to work for the post office. I hated that job. It made me miserable. People would leave comments on this channel when I finally quit that job to do this full time. They told me I was nuts. They told me I was bat crap crazy. Who cares if it was long hours and if it sucked and if it was hard and if it made me miserable? It had good benefits or whatever, or the pay was good, whatever. I wasn't happy. There was no joy in my life. Today there is, okay? And Dr. Frankel, in his book, confirmed that decision for me. Okay? Now, here is why it's so hard for those of us in America to do this. There's something within our culture that he points out that is unique to American culture, is that we base so much of our happiness, this idea of, there was a movie, what was it called? Pursuit of Happiness. He says happiness cannot be pursued. It has to be recognized. Here in America, we chase happiness, and all it does is run from us. In most European nations, they recognize things for which they have to be happy. I call that gratitude. Somebody said in the comments of the Hillbilly Elegy book review I did here, talking about how they could relate, coming from Appalachistan, how a full refrigerator and your bills being paid on time is a luxury for many of us. That makes me happy. Okay, I don't have to go out there and pursue the Lamborghini or the Porsche or the Mercedes-Benz. I find joy and happiness in my basic needs being met. And yeah, that makes me a dumb hillbilly. That makes me a simpleton. I find joy in finding happiness in that situation. Okay, so here's the deal though. Here in America, we try to chase happiness. Our happiness is result-based, as I've already shared with you, and we are guilt-shamed when we're not happy. So we are made to feel bad about feeling bad. Because if we feel bad, if we're not happy in our society, that is symbolic of not having achieved success in the form of a happy, joyous-filled career we love. So we are to be shamed for that. We are meant to be made to feel bad for feeling bad. So that creates a downward spiral which leads to clinical depression, years of therapy, where you're told you got to try to figure out how to be happy over an unhappy situation. Nuts. It's insanity. Okay? And then he uses another example in this book, and I think this is going to be my final example because nothing brings a point home more than this. Think about somebody you know who doesn't work, okay? Doesn't have a job, but not only doesn't have a job, doesn't belong to any groups, doesn't really have a lot of close family members or close friends. They don't volunteer their time. Now, my wife's from the Philippines, and I lived over there for 6 years. There are a lot of folks over there and in places, third world countries around the world, who would be envious to be in the position of the folks I just described, in that, let's say, for example, here in America, many of these folks receive aid from the government, and I am not stating my opinion one way or another about welfare here, okay? This is the time in the video where I will say, as I've said before, I can only control what I say. I cannot control how you take what I say, okay? This is not a pro or a con. It has nothing to do with my views on welfare or the welfare state. But I will tell you, having spent nearly a decade total in third world countries, there are folks in third world countries who would be envious of people in this country whose refrigerator is full and whose bills are paid on time, even though they don't work to have that done because they get checks from the government, okay? Frankel talks in his book about how there are many folks in that situation who, even though their basic needs are met and they even have extra afterwards, they still feel empty. And it's not because they have some sort of internal guilt shame toward being on entitlements. And it's not because others outside of themselves guilt shame them because of the entitlements. It's because they have no purpose. He did a study where he took similar socioeconomic folks who maybe they were on Social Security disability because they seriously had an ailment or a disability that hindered them from being able to work, okay? But they could volunteer. They did so at animal shelters, the SPCA. They did so with retirement home communities. They went out and they volunteered to help the elderly. They got out and they did something that benefited somebody other than themselves. What he found through this study is, though, even though their socioeconomic status did not change, they didn't have any more money in their pockets than they had before, but they felt needed and they felt worthy and they felt as if their lives now had meaning, and as a result, they felt better. They experienced joy And even though they still supported themselves and their households by way of entitlements, their lives had meaning. They had purpose. They exited clinical depression. They didn't need the therapy. They just needed to go down to the SPCA and pet cats 2 or 3 hours, 2 or 3 days a week. Or go to the senior center and call out the bingo numbers. Guys, this is what it's all about. It's about meaning. It's about having purpose. Okay, but what it's not about, and he warns about this throughout the book, it's not about the martyr syndrome. He says if suffering can be avoided, it should be. Remove the cause of the suffering. To go out and put yourself through any form of suffering just so you can say, look at me, look what I endured, now I'm going to go help other people avoid this, that's called masochism. Don't be a masochist. That's not the point here. But if you've gone through suffering, cancer, loss of a loved one, concentration camps, as painful and as difficult as it might be to do, figure out how to turn that suffering into purpose so you can go out and help others in an amazing way like Dr. Frankel did. So, I said here a few minutes ago that he gives us an exercise in how to practice these 3 principles in our life going forward so that we feel as if our lives do have meaning, so we can experience that joy and it's not contingent upon the outcome of an event. You know, that job, okay, that we hate that makes us miserable, okay? Having the courage, how do we, you're saying, okay, Crazy Lake, it took a lot of guts though for you to quit that job that even though you hated it, it made you miserable, it did pay good, it did have benefits, you're doing what you love now, you made it, you're probably the minority and I might be, I don't know, but how do you find that courage? Dr. Frankel sums it up thus. He says, live as if you were living for the second time and had acted as wrongly the first time as you were about to act now. Live as if you were living for the second time and had acted as wrongly the first time around that you lived as you're about to act now. What's that mean? Basically what that means is, you know, people think we should envy youth. We should envy the young. Frankel points out, not necessarily. They have a lot of potentiality, a lot of potential. I love that word, by the way, going forward. But what older folks have is they have a lot of actuality. There's things they've actually done. Okay? Those are arrows in their quivers, things they've accomplished. That's to be admired. So we only get one chance. The only thing I do know about life is that none of us get out of it alive. Don't live it in fear. As Dr. Frankel says, act as if you've been here before. You have your job you hate that makes you miserable. You have no sense of meaning in your life. Tell yourself, you know, wait, or you know what? I did this the first time around and it was wrong. I want to go do that and then go do it. And so what if you fail? So what if it doesn't work? Just tell yourself, well, that'll probably go just as wrong as it did the first time around, and all that did was lead to misery. What do I have to lose? You might find what you have to gain. Joy, meaning, purpose, and a life well lived. See you for more next time from here at Homesteading Off the Grid.